This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Ziak and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. Jay, we have a new patron. We need to welcome a new patron to the union, Amy Kern. Welcome, Amy.
Hello.
We
Nice
hope
to
that
have you,
you
Amy.
have enjoyed your perusal of our 80s episodes. This episode we're doing now is going to be relevant to our 80s episodes, but we have all those 80s episodes exclusive to our patrons, which Amy now has access to, as well as our private Discord, where people talk about things, music, gardening, television shows, whatever strikes you. Whatever strikes you. And as well as you'll have access to our box newsletter over at Patreon, because that goes out every week with new reviews of 80s and 90s music. So getting all the plugs in right up front before we get to this episode. And this was one where, Jay, we had previously done an episode for our 80s episodes, which are exclusive, I mentioned. And now that was the debut album. And now we're getting to check out the band sort of at its, I don't know, commercial, most like more people knowing about the band probably than ever based on the success of their previous single. But I don't want to give it away.
Be the first time this has happened, right? We haven't done a 80s episode first and then a 90s for the same band.
No, we've done the other way, but not this way.
Yep.
So
that's fun.
Without further ado, let's welcome our patron. He's been here before. You might know him from such episodes as Skinny Puppy's The Process, Night Wishes Oceanborn, Nights Are Abhead, and last year's the Garo. Oh, I can't remember how to pronounce this. The Garo Tokyo Anal Dynamite. I don't remember how to say the name. I'm sorry, Josh. Welcome back, Josh.
Glad to be back on with y'all, and it's that was the Gary Gay for the record. But anyway,
gay. That's right. That was the record of 2021 that summed up all our feelings about 2020. That was the cultural zeitgeist record, as I'd like to think of it. But you're back with a pick that we mentioned. We've done this band first in our 80s episodes. Now it's our 90s episode. Share with the listening audience what you brought to the table.
So normally I like to bring in artists from left field for y'all to cover. This time I went with a mainstream artist, but their most left field record. And that would be Faith No More's Angel Dust.
Yes. This comes on the heels of their 1989 album, The Real Thing, which of course people know because of their epically large single, Epic, that you couldn't escape. It was all over MTV. It still is, like, if you go on a classic rock radio, I mean, it's scary to think that this is qualifies, but if you, like, this will be played, you will hear, like, this song, then a Soundgarden song, and then Black Sabbath, and then, like, Three Dog Night on a classic rock station. It's so weird to hear all these bands all described as classic rock, because none of you would have never thought of them as classic rock in the time period they existed, but that's where we're at now. So when did you get into Faith No More, Josh?
So I'm more of a 90s kid, so I kind of came along and got into music after Epic really broke out, but because I was listening to so much alternative rock radio, it would still get play occasionally on the rock stations around Cleveland. So, I heard it just from that, and I always really liked that song. I was a big fan of, the funk metal style in general, and I still have a bit of a soft spot for it. But I didn't really have history with them beyond that for a long time. It wasn't until much later in my life, really just within the last few years, that I went through more of Mike Patton's back catalog, and I stumbled upon this album, and it's become a very special one to my heart. So
excellent. Jay, what's your familiarity with Faith No More?
Well, like everybody, I remember when they broke on MTV for Epic, and then became a little bit aware of the album prior to that we reviewed in the 80s. And I remember, and I'm looking at the dates, it was quite a bit of time. What, three years at least between records, which is a long time to wait. And I kind of remember that.
Mike Pat went to make that Mr. Bungle record.
Yeah.
That's why.
And I kind of remember a lot of anticipation building around, was this band going to be, were they sort of like an MTV hit, one hit wonder kind of thing, or, where were they going to go next? So I remember when this came out, it was a big deal commercially, but then I also remember, like, pretty quickly, it was one of those records that, like, lots of different people seemed to respect and like, that I was friends with, regardless of whatever kind of music they liked. It just sort of, I think, went to the next level or creatively for the band. And I remember the singles being very distinctive at the time and really kind of unlike anything else that was going on. So I believe I own it on CD. And so I got into the band even more probably on this record, and then the one after it, after Jim Martin leaves, I was kind of into as well. So this is probably the height of my familiarity with the band and the record that I have probably listened to most from Faith No More.
Gotcha. I thought that I didn't know this record, but apparently I listened to it at some point, because as soon as Midlife Crisis hit, I was like, wait a minute, I know this. And then A Small Victory, and I was like, wait a minute, I know this. And then Be Aggressive, and I'm like, how do I know so many songs from this record if I didn't listen to this record? So at some point I must have. I'm guessing that some point in the 2000s, when I acquired a lot of cheap CDs and then ended up selling them back, I must have ripped this at some point, because it's in my MP3 standalone tower of memory. So it's not at the best, it's only at like 96K, but it's in there. So I remember it's the next album, King for a Day. I remember when that came out, because the single got pushed at our radio station, but I didn't, like, at the time I didn't do a deep dive on the band, and I didn't really realize. I made a comment in our Discord that, the average American probably only knows Epic. Like, they don't know this band. And I guess I didn't realize at the time how big this record was in terms of, it went gold in the United States, 500,000. That's for this record, that's pretty good. I mean, this is not a mainstream album. Number 10 on the US Billboard 200.
I mean, it got a heavy push. Keep that in mind. I mean, there was a lot of money.
But it charted all over the world. Number 4 in Australia, number 6 in New Zealand, number 2 in the UK. It did some numbers. And I think what was interesting is, so when I listened to this based on the original release, which does not include Easy, the cover of the Commodore song.
Right.
Because I knew that, but they released like multiple versions of this, because that had been on an EP, and then they re-released this a year later after the release date with that song as like the final track on the album, which is odd.
Yeah, I'd heard that. I was confused when I went back and for this episode, because I always knew that song as like a B-side. I never realized it was ever part of any release of this record, which was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know either. So let's get to some comments over at Patreon, folks who were excited for us to talk about this record. We'll talk about the poll results at the end of the show, but Scott Holgram said, the best. That's your podcast, the best. You can skip what doesn't work for you. Kyle Bittner said, amazing album. Everything's Ruined is my favorite Faith No More song. And when I worked at a used record store comic book shop, I would play RV at the end of our night to get people to leave. That's interesting. Hal Phillips says, this is the best Faith No More album. John Seaman, great album. Last one with Jim Martin, so many great tunes, but the ones that always stuck out to me was RV because it's so weird. Darren Svedson says, awesome collection. Was a huge Faith No More fan back in the day. Revisited this a few months ago and it still holds up. Jeremy Amen listened to this past summer for the first time in over a decade. There might be one or two songs that I could take or leave, but this is a very worthy album. I still remember my middle brother bringing home the cassette the week it came out. My brothers and I sat there listening to it and kept taking turns commenting on how weird, wild, and interesting it was. Nothing else like it. I also remember the conversation suddenly stopping when I asked what a jizzlobber is. Never got an answer. The music must have got extra interesting then. Gavin, very worthy album. I've always been meaning to put this forward, so hoping you do it justice. My love of Be Aggressive is noted here already, a song that must be impossible to write and shouldn't work, but is amazing. And lastly, Richard Waters said, although I prefer the two albums directly after this, it's still an amazing album that has so many different elements to it. There's so much diversity and crazy stuff going on, yet it seems to flow together so well. There are all kinds of different songs, some quirky and avant-garde, some very metal and heavy, while others are good, catchy pop songs. He wrote a lot of stuff here, but I just get to the end. He said, my only slight complaint is that it sounds a bit dated and I'm not a massive fan of Jim Martin's guitar tones. I can't wait to hear what Tim's family made of this when he played it. We're the album in a 90s classic. And then Jeremy said, Tim and his wife and kids were singing Crack Hitler for days after hearing this album. I did not play this at full volume for the family. You know what I did play is the Chipmunks covers album that was tuned down to 1/16 the original speed, so you can listen to Belinda Carlisle's Heaven is a Place on Earth sound like a death metal Joy Division dirge. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's the strangest thing, and I'm obsessed with listening to it right now. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get into this record, Angel Dust, a title that Jim Martin was not a fan of. And it rejected it, but Roddy Bottum wanted that to be the name of the album. So we should mention, we've already done an 80s episode, but we didn't do a history of the band then. But Billy Gould, Roddy Bottum, Mike Borden, Mike Patton, Jim Martin, those are the members of the band. This was produced, engineered, and mixed by Matt Wallace, well-known producer, worked with a lot of people. Everyone from The Replacements to Maroon 5. And that's it. Yeah, that's all the stuff we need to cover because people know who Faith No More are. I'm not going to do a huge thing. So June 8th, 1992, this album drops. Jay, tell me one thing you like about Angel Dust by Faith No More.
I love the way that they combine keyboard with, I guess, almost funk-like rhythms. I mean, there's a lot of propulsion and the drumming is very heavy. I mean, Mike Borden also played drums for Ozzy Osbourne.
Yep.
But there's like a funk element to the bass at times, just in the way that he plays. And the way that those two things come together with these bursts of almost classic thrash metal. And I'm going to push back on the Jim Martin's guitar tone. I think that's what makes this so cool, is that it's not a sort of later 90s, like extremely overdriven, like new metal sound. It's still got that classic kind of thrash tone, And I think there's something magical that happens when you combine that with these synths that are like over the top at times, in terms of the sounds that Roddy Bottum is using, not traditional sounds that you would use in a heavy rock band, but somehow like the way that that comes together with this very very tight and just really strong rhythm section is unlike anything else. And I think this record is the best example, because after this you don't have Jim Martin anymore. The guitars change, the sensibilities of it change. There's also something I think here where the guitars at times play less of a prominent role. They let the keys come forward, and obviously let Mike Patton do a lot more on this record than on the previous record, or he just, sort of is in his creative prime here. So you're getting a lot more vocally going on, and there's just a really cool balance between all of those things. So the songs where those things are all at the forefront, I would even say the ones that are probably more keyboard driven. I think Midlife Crisis is a good example. So is Small Victory, where that's simply that sound that starts that song. It's just like, what in the world? Like, how is this a rock song in 1993? Like, totally original and just unique sounds and way that they bring that all together. So I think when the keyboards are prominent and the songs are kind of based around those, is probably where it's the most magical, in terms of a unique sound, this sort of beautiful, haunting keyboard sound with this super aggressive, propulsive rhythm section, and these kind of chuggy, riffy guitars. It's a really cool combination. And I guess the last thing is obviously, Mike Patton, like I mentioned here, is really coming to his own. He's the man of 1,000 voices. Like, he sings in so many different ways, and is such a technically good singer, but also so aggressive and emotional. You kind of hear the full range of his capabilities on this. And from singing, big hooks to almost playing characters and doing voices and lots of overdubs and great performances. So I think the second thing is just, his talent obviously comes through on this record, without any question. So that's some of the stuff that I liked. How about you, Tim?
Well, there's a lot to like. I want to go back to Small Victory for a moment. When I re-listened to that song over a couple times, I was like, this is a David Bowie song. If you swap out David Bowie for at least the verse parts, it gets a little heavier in the chorus parts. But if you could swap out David Bowie, and that could have been on any of his 90s records. Like that, that has, because of that weird, I don't know what scale that is, but it's not atypical scale that you use in rock music. It has like an almost like Arabic, Middle Eastern kind of scale going on with that keyboard part that's happening. There is just like this vibe of Bowie-ness on that song. And I think throughout this record, there are bits and pieces where I go, I don't know if that's an homage, but like that's definitely sounding like something. But they're so good musically. And the same thing with Mr. Bungle. I mean, they can just play anything. And sometimes I think what I liked that maybe didn't work for me as well with Mr. Bungle is that they can pull that stuff off here, but they construct really good songs. Whereas Mr. Bungle was a little bit more hard for me to figure out what was going on half the time.
Yeah.
Because it was so dramatic in its shifts. Whereas when you get these guys and you have the keyboard, I think the keyboard is just like such a great weapon in their arsenal that it completely separates them from anybody else. You know, nobody else was using a keyboard in that way in this type of, because this you take that out and this could very easily be a very weird grunge band. You know what I mean? And you just adding that layer of synth to so many songs, it adds this weird melancholy to a lot of the songs. You're like, it makes it sound more, I don't know, dramatic in ways that you don't expect. And they're very smart about where they use it. And I think this is just such a fun record it's not for everybody. I mean, I'm just going to say, you know, if you're not into thrash metal, I mean, you're going to have a couple tracks to skip. And a track like RV can be real polarizing because of just because it's, you know, I mean, it's like listening to the thing that reminded me of was the song Bugs on Pearl Jam's Vitology, where you're like, what is this mayhem? Do you remember that song, Jay?
If Tom Waits did a metal album.
Or if Tom Waits did a metal album.
Yeah. Like that.
I like that.
Backside melts into the sofa. My world, my TV, my food. Besides listening to my belly girl. And Michelle's the blue. Yeah, I sweat a lot. Pants fall down every time I bend over. My feet itch. Yeah, I'm here to scarecrow. I hate you talking to myself. Everybody's staring at me.
So, but I think like so much of this record is just brilliant, and they're obviously smart. As you know, Mike Patton's a smart lyricist, and like you said, he can shift his vocal from song to song and do such interesting things that it's just such an interesting listen all the way through, and there's nothing to get bored with. I mean, within songs they I think pull off the weird changes between styles and time signatures and all that much more fluidly than a lot of bands of similar ilk. Not that there are a lot of bands, but there's just something that they do here. I think it's because maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, Mike Borden's a really amazing drummer. I mean, the stuff that he's doing on here, but he's not super like flashy. Like he's not doing these gigantic fills in between parts, and he's not. I mean, he just comes up with like really inventive rhythms and propulsive backbeat to just a lot of these songs that like you're not expecting it, and it's got a groove. But he's not showy in any sense.
He's got to fill. A lot of these songs, they'll be extended, like they'll hit chords and let them ring, especially on a guitar. Maybe even the strings or the synth will double that. So I find it remarkable in that he's got space to fill there. He doesn't just. I think he uses those opportunities to keep things interesting, and then also Mike Patton then has space to do stuff that's a little out there. So you can hear that push and pull of like, they know like, okay, we're going to keep it simple from a guitar and keyboard standpoint during the section. That means Mike Borden, okay, you do something cool and come forward. And now we're going to do a heavy riff or some keyboard melody that's really important. Let's simplify the drums. Like, you can hear that push and pull going on. They're all amazing players.
Yeah, Midlife Crisis, I think, is a good example of that, where Jim Martin just hitting like these big chords at times, and he's doing that thing where I'm guessing there's extra percussion that he's either adding to his kit or putting it on afterwards, but it's just a super, super groovy rhythm.
Yep.
And he carries that song. And then Mike Patton is obviously doing something really cool on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a ton to really enjoy with this record. What works best for you, Josh, on this album?
Ooh, boy. One of the things that really stood out to me, so I'm also a huge fan of The Real Thing, their album before this, the one with Epic and all that. I really dig that album too, but one of the things that stood out to me as a major improvement with Angel Dust is, you kind of hinted at this earlier, the lyrics. A lot of The Real Thing, if you really take a closer look at the lyrics for it, a lot of it's just inscrutable. Like, there's just not really a whole lot there if you look at it. Whereas here, there's a lot more distinct themes of, stuff about, say, capitalism and such, or, was it basically like families and their relation to kids, like RV, for example, like the closing lines of that one, like that really stood out to me, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I love, or, Land of Sunshine, which is one of my favorite songs from this album overall. But what's funny with that one is, for those who don't know the story, Land of Sunshine and Caffeine, Mike Patton, he wrote the lyrics for those while he was up for, I think, 48 hours straight or something like that. And Land of Sunshine in particular, all the lyrics for that were taken from infomercials and the Church of Scientology's psychological quizzes. True story.
That's great.
It's one of those things where I read that he got some of the ideas were like literally off of cookies from Chinese meals where you crack open to get your fortune.
Yes.
And he was literally just using fortune cookies as a driver for lyrical inspiration. But I think sometimes what happens is you can find some unintended meaning or themes when you start building on sort of these simple universal ideas. I also like the fact that I feel like he put as much effort, like you could do a lot of that dumb lyrical free association stuff and it could sound cool in the same way that, like, sometimes I listen to Beck lyrics and I'm like, he's just throwing words that have a lot of choppy consonants together so that it sounds interesting. But what is he actually saying anything? But Mike Patton remembers like the hooks, and even if they're weird hooks that only make sense to him and, the people that really get this. All these songs have like really interesting, or the majority of them, obviously Midnight Cowboy doesn't, but have really interesting like lyrical turns that even if it's not necessarily the main hook of the song, there's always something, like you said, with like the ending of RV, you're like when that ends, I'm like, wait, what? Like, keep the story going. Even though I don't necessarily like love that song as a whole, like it goes on a little bit longer than maybe I would love, or maybe I would like, but there are always like little things that stick out. And then there's big things like in Be Aggressive, which is like, I don't know any other band that could pull that song.
Yes. And that's another one of the things that also that really worked for me was how Mike Patton throughout this, he just goes all the way in on whatever he's doing. And for some of the stuff in here, that's not easy. Like you mentioned, Be Aggressive, which, spoilers, that's literally my favorite Faith No More song ever. And I'm really glad one of the Patreon comments shouted that one out also, because that's not an opinion I see a lot. But that was written by Roddy Bottum, the keyboard player, because he was, I think, like one of the earlier members of a major rock band to be openly gay. And
Right.
he wrote that song solely to fuck with Mike Patton. But when he got it, he actually loved the song and he just went all the way with it. And like Kindergarten's another one I think of them too, how it's clearly like, it's very clearly tongue in cheek, but the way Patton sells it, I think, is what makes it work for that. Like he's doing that with an earnestness to it still.
I think he does so
Yeah,
along
100%.
the whole record. I mean, because, you know, there's so much, like I mentioned, so much diversity. What is the song that I'm thinking of? Not Malpractice. Is it Smaller and Small? No. Which one am I thinking of? There's one that's like very mellow that they compared to the Carpenters. And I was like, I could see this band unironically enjoying the Carpenters.
Midnight Cowboy?
Maybe that's it. Is that what I'm thinking? Is that what it is?
As far as
Yeah,
like,
it's got like a it's like an instrumental.
Oh no, that's an
accordion.
instrumental. That's the theme song to Midnight Cowboy.
yeah. As far as mellower stuff goes, I mean, Everything's Ruined, maybe. That's kind of on the mellower side for the album.
Yeah, although it's got a kind of a busy rhythm.
Yeah.
And it picks up. But so anyway, Jay, what doesn't work for you on this record?
Well, I tend to like when they like I mentioned earlier, when it's more keyboard focus. When they get too aggressive, no pun intended. It starts to just sound a little generic, like Crack Hitler, Jizzlobber. Even though those horror movie keys are really weird, there's something about that song that I also start to hear the prototype for a band like Limp Bizkit, like musically. Like when I listen to something like that, it becomes clear to me like probably where a lot of those new metal bands got their inspiration. That this record, I'm pretty confident was in their catalog. So I think that just the stuff that's a little bit more straight metal or just full on aggressive all the time. Malpractice is probably another good example. It's not that it's bad. It's just, I don't know. I want to get back to the other song because it's more unique and just gets me more like excited. I don't know. When I listen to the other stuff where they've got that balance going on, it's just so, there's so much going on there. I think you hit it with, you go from a sound that without the keyboards would be just angsty and angry and aggressive to a sound that's dramatic, mysterious, somber, sad. Like it just gets so much more complex. So I would say that's the only thing that doesn't work for me. I don't mind, like I'm with you on RV. It's kind of a fun little diversion. So I don't mind even those steps, you know, to doing things that are a little bit more just kind of weird or a little almost set pieces on the record where it's, you know, to take a left turn and tell a story for a minute and then come back. I think it's just the moments that are just maybe a little too typical metal are just okay. How about you, Tim?
I agree with you because I don't think it takes full advantage of Mike Patton. I think in the end, like the music is fine, but Mike Patton gets reduced to just sort of screaming a lot in those songs. Whereas you take a song like Kindergarten, which is a heavy song, but it allows him to really like do a lot vocally. Like there's one part where he hits a note and he is holding on to it. And I mean, he's in like, that's very rare air, like his vocal abilities. Like he could have probably sang. He probably could have fronted like a new wave British heavy metal band with as big as his vocal is. But because he's got this like side of him that's utterly irreverent, not irreverent, irreverent, and likes to put on these different voices and characters and tackle all these difficult songs as far as music goes. Like that obviously wouldn't have been interesting to him to just stick to one style. But I do like it better when he's more in singing mode than like what's happening in Jizzlobber. Like, because I'm not a big enough thrash metal, death metal fan to want to hear screaming and grunting and stuff like that. So it's like, it doesn't make me want to keep the song on. So, is there anything that doesn't work for you, Josh? Any particular songs maybe that stick out?
Okay. Yeah, I've been thinking about this. So I guess I might be kind of the opposite of y'all because I'm more of a metal guy in general, I guess. Metal and punk and all that. So I am more here for the screaming. I mean, I wouldn't want a whole album of that because I do agree with you regarding Mike Patton's talents, but I'm glad that they're there as, as just another side of him on the album. And Malpractice in particular might be a top 3 song for me on that album. It's tough sledding, tough competition, but that one might be up there for me. But I honestly feel like, if anything, the Midnight Cowboy cover is the only one that's kind of a miss for me. I guess just maybe it's that, it's the one track that doesn't really use Mike Patton at all. Maybe that's what does it for me. But I mean, it's just, I guess it's maybe that, no Mike Patton and no Jim Martin, who, I also a big, I love his work on this album too. Those are, that's a lot of what really makes the album for me at its core. So not having those elements, I guess, is just where it doesn't quite do it for me. Although the general tone of it, I do like the idea of that as the album closer, at least.
Yeah, I think
really weird with the deluxe edition that it ends on 2 covers, Midnight Cowboy and then Easy, which are just so not what the rest of this record is about.
Right. I think if Crack Hitler and Jizzlobber did not come at the end of the record back to back, because I don't mind Malpractice. I think there's some really cool elements to that song. I think if maybe they were spread out more, because it's like those 2 songs, which are not necessarily my favorite, and then the Midnight Cowboy cover, which is fine, but it could have been a hidden track or something. I didn't necessarily need to be an official track on the record. I don't think it adds anything overall. It might just be a track listing thing for me. But I mean, I don't think it takes away from the overall album in terms of like, I don't turn them off when I'm listening, over and over again. So the one thing I wanted to touch on, so because we brought it up in when we were talking about on Discord earlier, what is this band's legacy in terms of their importance to 90s music? Because they don't get mentioned with Pearl Jam, Nirvana, even REM in terms of like the big names. But you were mentioning it, Jay. I mean, you could make the argument that Limp Bizkit or Korn or some of the new metal bands that combined like heavy guitar riffs with hip hop vocals, essentially, probably were listening to this.
Yep. That's what I was just going to say, that, they're not really lumped in with the grunge set, but their influence carries more over to the next generation after that. And like, I mean, a lot of those bands you mentioned, they themselves have outright mentioned Faith No More is a huge influence. I mean, Korn, they've talked about it constantly, for example. And like when I hear like particularly like for example, Midlife Crisis, Mike Patton's vocal in the verses on that, like that's something I hear and think, Korn must have picked something up from, that's that style of vocal is something I hear in them, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sort of looked at it like you had Faith No More with Epic, and then the other thing that seemed to translate in terms of, I guess you'd say, call it new metal, is the Anthrax Public Enemy matchup on Bring the Noise. Because that to me was an eye opener. I was like, holy cow! I ran out and bought that Public Enemy cassette because I was like, what? This is the most amazing thing that my parents would never listen to. Like, you know what I mean?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting about Faith No More is that not only they check the box with, okay, they had a big song in the late 80s, early 90s that had a rap style vocal over a metal track, but musically, when you listen to this record, I hear a lot of the concepts that new metal went on to use. I mean, his vocals aside, which I agree were super influential in those bands, I think there's like that funk bass sound, these super punchy drums, the thrash guitars, the use of like harmonics, and even like the way that the keyboards create kind of this ambient drone kind of thing. I mean, those are all things that Korn and countless other bands would pick up on and sort of evolve and create in the later 90s, a whole different sort of take on alternative via metal. So, vocals and musically, this band was super influential in that way.
And I find that really, really interesting because one of the things I read about this album, since, it was seen as a commercial disappointment at the time, and the label, like, I guess, wasn't pleased with the direction they took musically on it. And they were what they said that I found interesting was, Alternative never liked you guys anyway. And basically in terms of, why they should have just done Epic 2 was their feeling on that, more or less. But that's something I found really interesting given, where their influence ended up lying in the long run.
Yep.
Neat little tidbit.
Yeah, it's like they were a little maybe ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Like this record maybe seeded a lot of other artists that took a year or two to kind of percolate and kind of break through, and then they had already moved on to the next thing. So definitely, I even remember at the time when I listened to this record, it took me a while to absorb what was going on, and I still don't think I understood at the time. I mean, things like in Midlife Crisis where they're using samples, that was unheard of at the time for a rock band to be doing stuff like that. And then obviously all the other stuff that we've talked about, like Pat's singing style, the use of keyboards, so many things were just so different that I remember it feeling like almost from the future when I first heard it at the time. So I think they were before their time, particularly on this record.
Was that one that got stuck in your car for a month or 2 months because you bought it and you had to listen to it even if you didn't understand it?
No, it was pretty popular with my friends. I was in a band in high school, and everybody in the band was into this record. It was everywhere.
Well, I think we've reached the point where we should take a look at what our patrons did in terms of voting. I don't think it'll surprise you. And I don't think our reviews will be a surprise when we discuss our final verdicts here. Worthy album, better EP, decent single, Jay.
Worthy album. This is the Faith No More album that I'll, always go back to whenever I want to hear the band. To me, this is their sound at its best. I would probably chop off Midnight Cowboy and Easy and sort of listen to the 12-track version. That would be my ideal version of all the versions that have come out. And call it a worthy album.
I agree with you. 100% worthy album. I think it is for people who haven't heard it, it's definitely worth checking out. I'm glad that we're going back to it because, like I said, I only kind of remembered 3 songs. So getting to hear the rest of the record and how creative it is, and it just does not sound like anything else from 1992. I can tell you that. If there is, please let us know because we're missing out. Josh, where do you land?
I'm sure this is going to absolutely shock you guys. Worthy album, and not even just worthy album. Actually, I would go so far as to say this is still my single favorite rock album of the 90s period. That's where I'm at with this.
Boom.
Oh, interesting.
But it wasn't your first pick.
Well, I had to break you guys down with all my extra weird choices first.
You did.
Make this one all the more pleasurable to you.
This was I could see the process where you started with Skinny Puppy and then Nightwish and then Nights Are Ebb and then last year it was a process of softening us up,
breaking us down,
and now we're being built back up again, like the warriors we are. Well, our patrons almost unanimously agreed. 92% went with worthy album. 8% went with better EP. So that's a landslide of Reagan Mondale proportions right there. It's actually less of a landslide because Mondale didn't win anything. I don't think. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, good. Because that means you're young and you have your life ahead of you, unlike the rest of us. So worthy album from us, from the patrons. You should go check it out if you have not. If you're just familiar with Epic, the single, then definitely give it a listen. Josh, thank you for bringing this to us. This is a great pick. Glad to have it in our catalog now.
Yep. Definitely appreciate the kind words, and I kind of figured it would go over really well, but still glad to see y'all confirm it. This is still an album I listen to, and I'm really glad to share it with anyone out there who might be listening. So thank you very much for having me on and for giving this wonderful, brilliant piece of work its due.
Awesome. And thank you for, being a part of the community, and we love all the picks you've given us over the years. They have definitely expanded in all seriousness, Jay and I would never have listened to Nightwish or Skinny Puppy on our own. We might have heard a song or two there, but like getting to dive into those records definitely provided. I think we actually gave Skinny Puppy a better rating than you did.
You did. I remember that.
I think Jay and I were like, wow, this album's awesome. You're like, I think it's an EP.
Like, it's okay.
The thing, my favorite Skinny Puppy albums are from the 90s, but they're the ones that are not rock. So I went with the more rock one to fit your theme better.
Gotcha. That's right. Well, we appreciate you serving us up a softball for that one. That was nice of you.
Yeah.
I want to remind folks they can go to digmeoutpodcast.com. That's where you go to do a lot of things. One, you can suggest an album there on our suggest an album page. You just throw the name of the album in and the artist and your name, and you give us a little description, and it goes into our hopper. And every month, our patrons get to vote on a new album for us to review. Comes from the website. And not only do they get to vote on those, they get to vote on episodes like this when we got new reviews coming up picked by our patrons. They also get to hang out at our Discord, talk music and all the things happening in the world that are not scary. We only talk about fun things like chipmunk music that's been tuned down 1/16 and sounds like lost Bauhaus recordings. And then also we like to post some 80s episodes like we did for the first Faith No More album. That was our 7th 80s episode. We're already in the 20s now. Done so many 80s episodes. And we got more coming up. We just did Dio. We got a new one coming up next month in April. So you gotta join Patreon for that. It's also where you can go to read the Box newsletter, which you can sign up for via our website. The Box newsletter is every month. New albums, music, books, TV shows, 2 reviews a week, plus a calendar of all the new releases for you to check out. And lastly, Apple Podcasts. Leave us some positive feedback. Our gentle egos need some stroking. They're fragile, as they say. So for Jay, I'm Tim, and we're out. We'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.